Kececioglu.
Very good.
Speaking about parameter inference.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure and an honor being here. It's a very exciting conference. I'm going to talk about a line of work that we've been doing in something called parameter inference and what we call parameter advising. And this has been a joint work with former PhD students Dan de Blasio, who's here, and Yigu Kim, done at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Arizona. So computational biologists often want the best reconstruction of something that they can't observe directly. For instance, sequence assembly. We can't see the underlying sequence. We have to reconstruct it from data that we can observe, like sequencing reads. Phylogeny inference, we can't have seen the process by which the species evolved. We have to reconstruct it from other data, possibly a multiple sequence alignment. Protein folding, oftentimes we don't know the exact fold. We're going to reconstruct it from data we have, like the actual amino acid sequence. And a problem that's very dear to my heart, multiple sequence alignment. We don't know the right way in which these sequences align. We have to try to infer it. And in all these problems and many others, this best reconstruction that we're trying to find is the solution to some optimization problem. There's some model that describes that optimization problem. And essential to the model is the objective function that's being optimized. What is the criterion that we're going to optimize in order to deem this reconstruction as being best? So typically, the objective functions that we have in computational biology have a lot of free parameters, values that appear in the objective function for which we don't know exactly what the right value should be used, and accordingly have to be tuned. As we vary the values of these free parameters, the objective function changes. So the reconstruction that you get as being optimal is going to be different. And small changes in these values can radically affect the solution that's output as being the best reconstruction. And since this affects the reconstruction itself, it affects the accuracy. Right? And ultimately, what we want is to solve these models, compute these alignments, fold these proteins, reconstruct these genomes that are as accurate as possible, that are as faithful as we can find to the unknown true reconstruction. So we're going to consider two problems in finding parameter settings for these free parameters in the objective function. One in which we call parameter inference. So here, informally, we want to find the best default parameter setting. So we're going to find a single assignment of values to all the free parameters in the objective function such that we get the highest accuracy on benchmark data. So benchmark data is special data for which we somehow know the correct reconstruction. So now we're trying to find a single parameter setting such that when we solve the model, we get the correct reconstruction, or as close as possible to it as we can get. So that's in terms of accuracy. And typically, you don't want to do this for one example. You have an entire collection of such benchmarks. And in that situation, you want to optimize the average accuracy over the entire collection of benchmarks. So this is typically how default parameter settings are found. And then that's the one that works best on average. If there's a single parameter setting you're going to try in the wild, you'd like to use the optimal default setting. Parameter advising, on the other hand, is for a user's specific input data. So they want to solve this reconstruction problem on their data. For that specific input data, you want to somehow find a parameter setting that achieves high estimated accuracy on that instance, on that input data. Okay? So parameter inference is finding a default that tries to work well on all possible input data on average. Parameter advising is for a specific input, trying to find a good setting for that instance of the problem. Okay? You want to have high accuracy for that instance. Now in practice, you can't typically evaluate the accuracy of a reconstruction because you don't know the ground truth. So in this practical setting of parameter advising, we can't measure accuracy exactly. Instead, we're going to have to estimate it somehow. So that's one issue in parameter advising. How do I estimate the accuracy of my reconstruction when I don't even know the ground truth? And in that setting, we're going to try to find a parameter setting that achieves high estimated accuracy. That's the best we can do in that setting. And so for both these problems, the inference problem, the advising problem, we developed algorithms. So we have actual guarantees on how they perform. The algorithms that we have are actually general. They're not problem specific. As long as your reconstruction problem satisfies some relatively mild conditions, these algorithms will solve these inference and advising problems. But I like to do concrete things and evaluate how well they work in practice. So I'm going to apply both these techniques, parameter inference and parameter advising, to the specific problem of multiple sequence alignment, which I'm very much interested in. So we'll report results on how well we do on computing accurate alignments. So first we'll talk about parameter inference, and we'll do it for sequence alignment. So typically biologists use the standard model where for a pair of symbols, a pair of amino acids for protein sequences, or similarly bases for DNA sequences, we have a score for the substitution of replacing one symbol by another. And then we also allow insertions and deletions, a run of insertions or a run of deletions we call a gap. And typically we have a cost or a penalty for a gap that's an affine function of the gap length. So if I have L letters consecutively deleted or L letters consecutively inserted, that's a gap of length L. The cost for that gap will be some constant term plus some penalty here, lambda, per letter in the gap. Okay? So there's these two parameters that determine the gap cost function. All right. And so together, this ensemble of the substitution scores, usually represented by a matrix, the gap open cost, the gap extension cost, that specifies the scoring function that we're going to use to assign a score to an alignment A here. Okay? So we're going to study the dependence of the function on these free parameters here, which are the substitution and gap costs. Okay? And in this context, we're going to have it that we want to minimize the score. Okay? All right. So for instance, if I have this alignment of these snippets of two protein sequences, the score would be, well, I have 3 columns in which I have an identity on an A, 1, 2, 3. So the score is going to be 3 times the substitution score of an A for an A. There's no column that substitutes an A for a C, so I have 0 occurrences of that, and so on. There's 2 occurrences of changing an A with a P and 2 occurrences of changing a K with a V in this very short alignment. So that is a contribution of all these substitution columns in the alignment. And then I have 3 gaps here. So for the gap startup cost, I'll have 3 times it for the 3 gaps. And then the total number of letters in all the gaps is 7, so I'll have plus 7 times my gap extension cost, lambda. Okay. So one thing to note here is that this scoring function, it's linear in the parameters, okay? Where the coefficients for this alignment problem are how many times that particular event occurs in the alignment. Okay? All right. So in practice, as soon as you're going to start computing things, computing alignments, computing multiple alignments, you want to know, well, what are the right values to use for these parameters of the scoring function? And right means I want to fix those values such that I get the best possible reconstruction, the most accurate alignment computed. So people deal with this now because we compute alignments, and conventionally we use certain families of matrices for the substitution scores, say a PAM or a BLOSSOM or a VTML family, but that's pretty much by convention. Okay. There's some statistics on how to come up with those families, but nevertheless, statistics doesn't tell us at all, for instance, what the gap penalty should be. Okay. So typically what people will do for a tool that when they release or when they release an aligner, they'll manually tune those parameters, so it seems to work well on their particular collection of benchmarks to find their default parameter setting. So inverse parametric alignment, it's an objective way to resolve this question, and determine the right values for those parameters. So informally, we have to have examples of correct alignments, accurate alignments. So for some sets of sequences, we have a ground truth alignment of how they should be aligned. Then I want to find values for the free parameters such that each example alignment is an optimal scoring alignment of its strings. Okay? Because what the tool is going to do is try to solve an optimization problem on our objective function, compute the best scoring alignment. We want that correct alignment to be the best scoring one. Okay? That's the best parameter choice. So this is going to learn the values for the parameters from these examples. Okay? And in general, what an example for the particular problem is, for this input data, here's the correct output. So these examples are really pairs. I'm thinking of this alignment as a pair of the set of sequences and the alignment of those sequences. All right. And how do you get a correct alignment? Well, that's totally independent. If these are proteins, it may be based on structural alignment of the protein structures themselves. All right. So for inverse parametric alignment, we have an algorithm that actually solves this problem. One of the beautiful things is that in contrast to prior work on this, it takes arbitrarily many parameters. So it can deal with hundreds of parameters. If you're going to find values for hundreds of parameters, you're going to need a lot of benchmarks. So it can handle arbitrarily many examples in your collection of benchmarks. It runs in polynomial time. Okay? It handles something called partial examples, which we'll talk about later. So typically, if you have a benchmark example in which is showing the right reconstruction, the correct alignment, well, typically you don't know the correct alignment, say, across the entire length of the sequences. You may feel, this portion, I know how it aligns, but I don't know how it aligns everywhere. That's what we're going to call a partial example. So that's the type of data we typically have. We don't have complete examples. And given that we can do this, learn parameter values for arbitrarily many parameters, what that allows us to do is look at also more complicated objective functions, more complicated scoring schemes that take into account more sophisticated features. And we don't have to find these parameter values for these new parameters manually. We can use inverse parametric alignment to do it automatically. So we can look at much more complicated scoring models, more complicated objective functions, and automatically find parameter values for them. So for instance, we came up with a new way to align protein sequences that takes into account predicted secondary structure. And this is effective in practice. We have implementations of it. For multiple alignment, we get improvements of up to 20% in the accuracy for hard instances. And it's fast. So for instance, for a standard model with 200 parameters, given 400 partial examples, it took an hour on a laptop. So it's practical. And what's interesting is that if you look at the algorithm, which I'll talk about a little bit, for inverse parametric alignment, it doesn't just work for alignment. So it works for any optimization problem in which the objective function is linear in the free parameters. That applies to a lot of those problems in computational biology I showed as a start. And you have to be able to efficiently solve the optimization problem if the parameter values are fixed. So that's a pretty mild requirement. If you can't do that, it's actually not a good optimization problem. You can't solve it. So. All right, so that's a high-level overview of our results. So the basic inverse alignment problem is, I'm given these examples. So suppose I have k examples here, corresponding of an alignment for the corresponding strings in the alignment. Okay? So example is a set of strings and the corresponding alignment. I have a scoring function. I'm looking at its dependence on these free parameters. So you have t different parameters. What I want to find are values for all those parameters. I'm assuming the parameters take on real values. So I'm going to find real values for the parameters such that each example alignment is optimal for its strings when I use the scoring function with that parameter setting. Okay? So one thing to say here is this problem may not have a solution. So given a collection of k different alignments, there may not be one setting for all the t parameters that makes every one of those benchmarks alignments be an optimal alignment of its strings. So that formulation may not have any solution. And in practice, it almost never does. Okay? So what you have to do to have a practical result is we have to take into account error. So when the examples cannot be made optimal, we want to make them as close to optimal as possible. Okay? So our error is going to be, how close can you get them to optimal? If there's zero error, every example is made to be optimal. Okay? We want to be able to handle these partial examples, which have regions where the alignment's basically unspecified. I don't know the correct alignment in that region. Okay? And then we we talked about, well, we did work on how to extend it to more complicated models that have many more parameters. All right, so one way to have a criterion on error for inverse alignment is what we call absolute error. So given the examples, given the pre-parameters, I want to find this vector, this is this assignment of values to all the t parameters, that minimizes the average over all the examples, k examples, of the absolute error of the examples alignment versus the optimal alignment of those input strings. So here, b sub I star is the optimal scoring alignment under the parameter choice of the example strings, whereas a sub I is the benchmark alignment for that example. Okay. Now, the benchmark alignment, which you want to make optimal, is going to have some score under the objective function. Okay. And then this is the optimal scoring alignment. Okay. This is a minimization problem. So your examples alignment is always going to score at least as great as the score of the optimum. And that difference, that's what we're calling the absolute error. So I want to minimize the average difference in error between the score of each example and an optimal alignment for its input strings. That's the absolute error criterion. All right. You can write it as this difference, again, averaging over all the k examples. And another error criterion is what we call discrepancy. And this takes into account how well the optimal alignment under the choice of parameter values agrees with the example alignment. So we may not only be interested in how close it is in score, we may want to know how close is it structurally. How well does it match or agree with the benchmark alignment? So recovery error here for a given pair of alignments is, it's not symmetric. It's the percentage of columns of alignment A that are not in B. So that's the portion of A that's not recovered in B. So we're going to call it recovery error. So find alignment A and alignment B. I look at how many columns B doesn't agree with A, and there are 5 columns. So the recovery error is the fraction of these 5 columns that weren't recovered over the total number of columns. Okay. All right. So under this discrepancy criterion, the inverse alignment is given these benchmarks, the scoring function with these free parameters. I want to find an assignment of values to all the parameters that minimizes now the average discrepancy error. So that's the average over all the benchmarks of the absolute error in score, which you saw before, the difference in score, plus the recovery error. Okay? And in practice, what we do is we optimize a convex combination of those two. So there's 2 different types of error we're taking into account: error in score and recovery error. Okay? And this works much, much better in practice, actually. It's harder to solve, but we get much better parameter values. Okay? All right. So there's this issue of partial examples that I mentioned. So if you have a benchmark here alignment, you may not have confidence that all of that benchmark alignment is actually correct. There may be regions in which you're not sure. So those are what we call these unreliable columns. So essentially, in the unreliable columns of the benchmark alignment, the alignment's really not specified. Okay. All right. So maybe these reliable regions and these purple or blue unreliable regions, we'll call that a partial example. And if all the columns are reliable, we'll call that a complete example. Okay? All right. So how are we going to deal with partial examples? Well, we deal with this idea of completions. So if a partial example has some regions in which I don't know how it should be aligned, well, what I do is I realign the unreliable regions under some parameter choice. We're going to find the optimal parameter choice to do this by. And then I just stitch together the regions with the confident portions I have to get a complete alignment now. Okay? And we call it a completion. So there's many possible completions of a partial example. And we're going to compute the best possible completion for a given parameter choice, which is easy to do. And now our inverse alignment problem with partial examples is, given the examples and the scoring function, we want to find this parameter vector that minimizes our error criterion of interest over all possible completions of the partial examples, so a natural formulation. Okay. All right, the error measure could be absolute error or discrepancy error. Okay. All right. So we have an approach to solving this inverse parametric alignment problem that uses a reduction to linear programming. So we deal with partial examples using this notion of completions. We reduce the instance of the problem to a linear programming problem. This linear programming problem is going to be enormous. We can't actually write it down, but we can still solve it. We'll have to deal with degenerate solutions. We'll have to eliminate those from the linear program and we solve it in practice. And then the way we solve this linear program is with something called a cutting plane approach, cutting plane algorithm. So to give some idea of how we reduce inverse alignment to linear programming, we'll do it for the absolute error situation. That's a little simpler. So we're going to have inequalities in our linear program and variables. So the variables are going to be, I'll have one variable for each free parameter to describe what its real value is going to be in the parameter setting I'm trying to find. And then I'll have the following system of inequalities. So for a given example I have its benchmark alignment. Now I'm going to consider conceptually every possible alignment B of that example strings. So every possible alignment. Here's one that I deem to be correct. B is arranging over all possible alignments. And for every possible alignment B, I'm going to have an inequality conceptually that looks at the difference between the score under the objective function for some parameter setting x of the benchmark alignment minus the score under the same parameter setting of this alternate alignment B. Okay? So that's a score difference. Right? And notice that if I have a objective function that's linear in the free parameters, this expression here is linear in my variables x. Okay, so it's a difference of two linear expressions. And I want that to be less than or equal to a error variable delta that I'll have for that particular example. Okay? So I have these inequalities. Now, there's an exponential number of different alignments for a given set of strings. So this is really an exponential number of inequalities here for every example. So you can't write this down and solve it. Okay, that's one issue. And our objective function, we want to minimize the average absolute error. Well, for that, we can simply have our objective function be the average value of these delta variables, where I have one per example. Okay? And if I optimize this, we can prove that that's going to solve the inverse alignment problem with absolute error. Okay? All right. So how do we efficiently solve this linear program with an exponential number of inequalities? We make use of something called the equivalence of optimization and separation. And I only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to skip that. Okay. It'd be a lot. It'd be a mouthful anyhow. So, yeah, you have to believe me. You have to be able to solve something called a separation problem for each system of inequalities. If you can solve the separation problem efficiently, you can optimize that linear program efficiently. We can solve the separation problem in basically quadratic time. So. All right. To get to parameterizing, I'm going to skip this stuff about partial examples and the secondary structure model, experimental results. Okay, just a few things maybe about future directions in parameter inference. Let's say some of the key issues here. One is that, okay, what you're going to get out is this optimal default parameter choice. But that's not going to be unique. You might want to know what's the sensitivity of the individual parameters in that optimal parameter choice. And in general, for a linear objective function, that's going to be described by a polyhedron. It's going to be extremely hard to visualize. Okay, or how are you going to output that to the user, right? But what you can do is you could easily and efficiently compute a bounding box, okay, which will tell you how much can each parameter vary, give you a bound on how much each parameter can vary. Right? And still don't have a good analysis of the running time for the cutting plane approach. That's quite complicated. I think that partial examples in general are inherently hard. Okay? And optimally solving that problem over partial examples I think is NP-complete. I don't have a proof of that. That's just a conjecture. And in general, you'd like to be able to apply this to objective functions that aren't simply linear in the free parameters. Many objective functions are, but some aren't. And you could handle nonlinear objective functions by still writing down that system of inequalities, but now that difference is going to be a difference of two nonlinear objective functions. Okay? It's hard to handle constraints that are nonlinear. One thing you can do is move those constraints into the objective function using a Lagrangian relaxation. So I think that may be a practical way to tackle inverse optimization on nonlinear objective functions. And I only have a minute left, so I guess I'll stop there.
Hello in the back? No, you? Well, yeah.
One thing that clearly comes to mind is if you have a large enough ground truth set or a training set, you could try deep networks. Because, for example, Oxford Nanopore for the Minion system, they came up with the deep learning network called Deep Learning Paradigm, Deep Nano, that allows you to do alignment of all the reads that you get out of the nanopore system. So basically you have a similar question. You have an alignment, and there may be a lot of context-dependent errors. And I would think that in nature you also have alignments where you have a lot of parameters because all the deletion penalties may be dependent on the context and the sequence itself. So it would be potentially a good idea, especially if you're looking at nonlinear models, to look at neural networks. Has anyone done that?
I'd like to talk with you about that, yeah. So I tend to go for, I'm an algorithmist, so I want, to bound the running time. I want to get a guarantee. So I haven't looked at deep networks for this type of problem, but I'd be interested in discussing it with you. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Sure.
So maybe I have missed some points, so please forgive me if I did this, but it looked like, it sounded to me like there were two major assumptions that were being made. One of them is that given a ground truth, that there's a single parameter setting which produces that ground truth, but there could be multiple settings of the same parameter values.
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a unique solution.
Yeah, so that could be. And the other point is that given a parameter setup, that there's only one way to align one way to optimally get the result. But given a setting of the parameter, there could be multiple optimal solutions
Sure.
that are equally good as well.
Yes.
So given that there could be multiple parameter settings that are equally good with respect to the ground truth, and given a parameter setup that comes from the ground truth, there could be multiple optimal solutions. Your second criteria, which was the difference between your result and the result that you would get from the ground truth, now suddenly becomes very confusing because there are multiple.
Yes. So over all of the, so when you measure discrepancy, like how much does it differ from the ground truth alignment? If there are ties in the optima, it's going to implicitly be looking over all the tied optimal scoring alignments. It's going to find the one that agrees best with your benchmark alignment in this situation of ties. Yeah. So that's not actually hard to do. Yeah. And your other question about there being distinct parameter settings that may make your benchmark be optimal. If you want to solve the problem of finding a single parameter setting that makes your input alignment be the unique optimum, that can be efficiently solved. So if you have your benchmark reference and you want it to be the only optimal scoring solution for your problem, you can achieve that if it's possible. That's actually not hard to do for these linear objective functions. Yeah. All this is conditioned on that.
Let's thank our speaker again.